Maya Chen stood barely 5 feet tall, her frame so slight that a strong wind seemed capable of knocking her over. The other cadets at the Galactic Combat Academy towered above her, their alien physiques designed for warfare across 1,000 different worlds. The Karathi with their chitinous armor and razor-sharp claws. The Vextar with their massive bulk and bone-crushing strength. The ethereal Zephyrians whose energy-based bodies could phase through solid matter. And then there was Maya, the only human in her class, looking like a fragile flower among giants. Another human? Commander Thexanol's mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. The insectoid Korathi stood over 8 feet tall, his carapace gleaming under the Academy's artificial suns. They grow smaller every cycle. The other instructors shared what passed for laughter among their species. Humans had been part of the Galactic Coalition for only 50 years, and their reputation preceded them. Weak, soft, short-lived creatures who somehow managed to survive on a death world called Earth. Most considered them a curiosity at best, a liability at worst. Maya kept her expression neutral as she underwent the standard physical assessments. The gravity chamber tested her endurance at 5 times Earth normal. She lasted 7 minutes before collapsing, gasping for air while a Vextar cadet completed the same test without breaking stride. The strength evaluation showed her lifting capacity at roughly 1/10 that of her classmates. Her reaction time, while impressive by human standards, ranked dead last among the diverse species represented. "Perhaps you should consider the diplomatic corps," suggested Instructor Velthan, a crystalline being whose voice chimed like wind bells. "Humans have shown some aptitude for negotiation." Maya's jaw tightened. She had not traveled across half the galaxy to become a diplomat. Her grandmother's stories had shaped her dreams since childhood, tales of ancient human warriors who could adapt to any fighting style, who learned by watching and improved through sheer determination. Grandmother had been a martial artist before the first contact, practicing forms passed down through generations of her family. "I'm here to learn combat, sir," Maya replied quietly. The first month proved brutal. Combat training began with traditional Karathi blade work, emphasizing speed and precision strikes. Maya's human reflexes, swift by her species' standards, seemed glacial compared to her classmates. Her practice sword felt clumsy in her grip as she attempted to mirror the flowing, deadly dance that came naturally to the Karathi students. "Your stance is all wrong," hissed Cadet Zarthek, his primary arms gesturing dismissively. "Humans lack the proper joint flexibility for true blade mastery." Maya adjusted her position, studying the way Zarthek's legs bent at impossible angles, how his secondary arms provided balance, while his primary limbs wielded the training weapons. She could not replicate his alien anatomy, but perhaps she could adapt the principles to her own form. That night, alone in her quarters, Maya practiced the forms she had observed. She modified the stances, compensating for her human limitations while preserving the essential movements. Where Karathi students used their natural flexibility, she employed momentum and timing. Where they relied on instinctive reactions, she substituted careful analysis and prediction. Week by week, her performance improved marginally. Still last in her class, but no longer embarrassingly so. Her instructors noticed, but attributed it to basic human stubbornness rather than any particular talent. The second month introduced Vexitar grappling techniques. The massive bear-like aliens specialized in close-quarters combat, using their tremendous mass and strength to overwhelm opponents. Maya watched helplessly as her classmates paired off for sparring sessions. Even the smallest Vextar cadet outweighed her by a factor of 3. "I will be gentle, little human," rumbled Groktar, her assigned sparring partner. His concern seemed genuine, which somehow made the situation more humiliating. Maya found herself thrown across the training mat within seconds of each engagement. Groktar's strength was simply too overwhelming to resist directly. But as she picked herself up for the dozenth time, something in her grandmother's stories echoed in her mind. Stories of Aikido masters redirecting force rather than opposing it. Tales of jujitsu fighters defeating larger opponents through leverage and technique. She began studying the Vextar grappling style differently. Instead of trying to match their power, she focused on their momentum. Where did they commit their weight? When were they momentarily off balance? How could their own strength be turned against them? The breakthrough came during the 4th week of grappling training. Groktar lunged forward with his typical overwhelming charge, expecting to easily overpower her as he had dozens of times before. But Maya was no longer there when he arrived. She had stepped aside at the last possible moment, grasping his extended arm and using his own momentum to send him tumbling across the mat. The training hall fell silent. A Vextar had never been thrown by such a small opponent. Groktar rose slowly, his expression unreadable. "Again," he said simply. By month's end, Maya could consistently redirect the attacks of much larger opponents, though she still could not match their raw power. Her instructors began to take notice, though they attributed her progress to fluke rather than skill. The 3rd month brought energy manipulation training with the Zephyrians. These beings existed partially in phase with reality, their attacks consisting of concentrated energy bursts and the ability to become temporarily incorporeal. Maya's solid human form seemed laughably inadequate for this type of combat. "Energy flows through all things," explained Instructor Aerthis, her luminescent form shifting between visible and translucent. "But your species appears to be particularly dense to such flows." Maya closed her eyes, trying to sense the energy fields her classmates manipulated so effortlessly. At first, she felt nothing beyond her own heartbeat and breathing. But gradually, through hours of meditation and concentration, she began to perceive something else. Not the bright, obvious energy signatures of her Zephyrian classmates, but something subtler. Something that seemed to connect all living things in a web of barely perceptible interactions. Her first successful energy projection was pathetic by Academy standards. A barely visible flicker of light that lasted less than a second. But it represented something unprecedented. Humans were not supposed to be capable of energy manipulation at all. "Curious," murmured Aerthis, studying readouts from the training equipment. "Your energy signature is unlike anything in our databases, weaker than ours, but somehow more focused." Maya's progress with energy work remained limited, but she discovered she could sense her opponent's attacks before they manifested. The subtle changes in their energy fields preceded their physical movements by fractions of a second. Combined with her growing skill at reading body language across multiple species, this gave her an unexpected edge in sparring matches. As the semester progressed, Maya's reputation began to shift. She was still considered weak by Academy standards, but there was a growing recognition that she was somehow different from other humans. Her ability to adapt and learn seemed to exceed normal parameters for her species. The truth was that Maya was not learning the alien fighting styles so much as she was creating hybrid forms that incorporated elements from each discipline while remaining fundamentally human in nature. She took the precision and speed concepts from Karathi blade work, the redirection principles from Vextar grappling, and the awareness techniques from Zephyrian energy manipulation. But instead of simply copying these alien methods, she was synthesizing them into something new. Her human limitations, initially seen as weaknesses, were becoming advantages. Her smaller size made her harder to target. Her weaker energy signature made her difficult to detect with Zephyrian senses. Her inability to match alien strength forced her to develop superior technique. Most importantly, her human adaptability allowed her to combine fighting styles that her classmates, bound by their species' natural inclinations, could never integrate. By the end of her first semester, Maya ranked in the middle of her class overall. Not spectacular, but no longer the obvious failure everyone had expected. Her instructors noted her progress, but still considered her something of an anomaly rather than a serious combat prospect. What they did not realize was that Maya had only begun to explore the true potential of human adaptability. She had learned to observe, to analyze, and to synthesize. She had discovered that every species in the galaxy had developed fighting techniques optimized for their particular physiology and psychology, but no one had ever attempted to combine all these diverse approaches into a single unified system. As she prepared for her second semester, Maya smiled quietly to herself. She had proven that humans might be weak by galactic standards, but they were not limited by galactic standards. Her journey toward mastering every form of combat in the known galaxy had only just begun. The Academy's other students continued to see her as the small, fragile human who somehow managed to keep up despite her obvious disadvantages. They had no idea that they were witnessing the birth of something that would eventually change the nature of combat throughout the galaxy. Maya Chen was no longer trying to become the best human fighter at the Academy. She was becoming something entirely new, a living synthesis of every martial tradition the galaxy had to offer. And she was just getting started. Maya's second semester at the Galactic Combat Academy brought new challenges that would test everything she had learned. Advanced combat courses introduced her to species she had only read about in theoretical studies. The Nexari shadow dancers could manipulate darkness itself, moving through shadows as if they were doorways. The silicon-based Crystech could reshape their crystalline bodies into weapons at will. The ancient ethereals existed partially outside normal space-time, making them nearly impossible to predict or counter. Each new discipline seemed designed to highlight human limitations. Maya's classmates adapted to these advanced techniques with varying degrees of success, but their species' natural advantages gave them starting points she simply did not possess. Yet she approached each new challenge with the same methodical analysis that had served her during her first semester. "Today we study Nexari Shadow Combat," announced Instructor Velnath, a serpentine being whose scales seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "This art requires natural shadow sight and the ability to perceive multiple dimensional layers simultaneously." The Nexari students flowed through the training exercises like liquid darkness, appearing and disappearing through shadows that Maya could barely see. When she attempted to follow their movements, she found herself grasping at empty air while her opponents struck from unexpected angles. "Human vision is too limited," observed Cadet Sithara, her elongated limbs allowing her to reach through shadows that seemed solid to Maya's perception. "You see only the surface layer of reality." That night, Maya sat in meditation, considering the problem from multiple angles. Humans had evolved as diurnal creatures, dependent on visible light for navigation and survival. Their eyes had never developed the ability to perceive the shadow dimensions that Nexari used so effortlessly. But Maya's training had taught her that every limitation could be transformed into an advantage with the right approach. She began studying the way shadows moved under artificial light, how they shifted with changing angles and intensities. If she could not see into the shadow dimensions directly, perhaps she could learn to predict where shadows would form. She spent hours analyzing the geometry of light and darkness, understanding how Nexari movements affected the visible patterns of shade. Slowly, she developed a technique that used reflected light and shadow patterns to track Nexari opponents. She could not see them directly in their shadow dimensions, but she could observe the subtle changes their movement caused in the visible world. Combined with her growing ability to sense energy patterns, this gave her a crude but effective method for countering shadow attacks. Her first successful counterstrike against a Nexari opponent sent shockwaves through the advanced combat class. Cadet Morthek had attempted a classic shadow flank maneuver, appearing behind Maya through a dimensional fold that should have been completely undetectable to human senses. But Maya was already turning as he emerged, her training sword intercepting his strike with perfect timing. "Impossible," hissed Instructor Velnath. "Human senses cannot detect dimensional transitions." Maya said nothing, but filed away another piece of understanding about her own developing abilities. She was not detecting the dimensional transitions directly. She was reading the micro-patterns of light and air movement that preceded them, combined with the subtle energy fluctuations that every being produced regardless of their dimensional state. The Christek combat forms presented a different challenge entirely. These silicon-based beings could reshape their crystalline bodies into weapons, armor, or tools as needed. Their combat style emphasized adaptability and transformation, with no fixed forms or techniques. "Christek fighting has no set patterns," explained Master Quartzeth, his body continuously shifting between different configurations as he spoke. "We become whatever the situation requires. Blade, shield, hammer, net. All possibilities exist simultaneously." Maya watched her Christek classmates flow from one form to another with fluid grace. Their ability to instantly adapt their bodies to counter any attack or exploit any opening made them formidable opponents. But as she studied their techniques, she realized that their strength was also their limitation. They relied entirely on physical transformation, changing their bodies rather than their tactics. Humans could not reshape their bodies at will, but they could reshape their approach to any given situation. Maya began developing what she privately called conceptual transformation, the ability to shift her entire fighting style mid-combat to match whatever was most effective against her current opponent. Against a Christek fighter who had transformed into a massive hammer configuration, Maya adopted flowing Zephyrian movement patterns, staying just ahead of crushing blows while striking at the joints where transformation was most difficult. When her opponent shifted to a blade configuration, she switched to Vextar grappling principles, getting inside the weapon's reach and using leverage to disrupt the Christek's balance. The key insight came when she realized that while Christek could change their physical form instantly, they still thought in fundamentally Christek patterns. They transformed their bodies, but not their tactical approaches. Maya's human adaptability allowed her to change her entire conceptual framework for combat within the span of heartbeats. Her sparring match against Shardix, one of the top Christek students, became the talk of the academy. Maya never landed a decisive blow, but she also never allowed Shardix to establish dominance. For 20 minutes, she flowed from one fighting style to another, never giving her opponent time to settle into a rhythm or develop an effective counter-strategy. "Draw," declared the combat instructor, though his tone suggested this was unprecedented. Christek students were not supposed to be held to draws by physically weaker opponents. The ethereal combat techniques pushed Maya's adaptability to its limits. These ancient beings existed partially outside normal space-time, making them capable of attacks that seemed to violate basic laws of physics. They could strike moments before they moved, creating temporal paradoxes that confused even advanced AI combat analysis systems. "Ethereal combat transcends linear time," explained Master Epoch Mind, whose form seemed to flicker between past and future versions of itself. "We fight across multiple temporal layers simultaneously." Maya's classmates struggled with this concept even more than she did. The temporal nature of ethereal combat was so alien to normal thinking that most species found it completely incomprehensible. But Maya approached it as she had every other challenge, looking for patterns and principles that could be adapted to human limitations. She could not perceive time the way ethereals did, but she could learn to recognize the subtle environmental cues that preceded temporal attacks. The air pressure changes that occurred when someone struck backward through time, the energy fluctuations that announced a temporally displaced movement, the micro-tremors in local gravity that accompanied chronospatial manipulation. More importantly, she realized that ethereal combat relied on complex temporal calculations. If she could disrupt those calculations by introducing unexpected variables, she could neutralize their temporal advantages. Her human unpredictability became a weapon against opponents who could see multiple possible futures. During a sparring session with Master Epoch Mind himself, Maya managed something that no student had accomplished in centuries of academy history. She landed a strike on an ethereal master, not through superior skill or temporal manipulation, but through sheer tactical unpredictability that made accurate future sight impossible. "Fascinating," murmured Epoch Mind, studying Maya with new interest. "Your temporal signature is remarkably chaotic. It generates too many possible futures for accurate prediction." Word of Maya's achievements spread through the academy like wildfire. The weak little human was somehow holding her own against species that had mastered combat for millions of years. Theories abounded about genetic modifications, hidden human abilities, or technological augmentation. But the truth was simpler and more profound than anyone realized. Maya had discovered the ultimate human advantage in a galaxy full of specialized species. While every other race had evolved specific strengths for particular environments, humans had evolved the ability to adapt to any environment. They were generalists in a galaxy of specialists, and in combat, generalization was proving to be the ultimate specialization. She was not learning alien fighting techniques. She was learning to think like multiple species simultaneously, switching between different conceptual frameworks as the situation demanded. Her mind was becoming a living database of tactical approaches drawn from across the galaxy. The Academy's instructors began taking special notice of her development. Combat analyses showed that she was developing fighting patterns that had never been seen before, hybrid techniques that combined elements from multiple species in ways that should have been impossible. "Her neural activity is remarkable," reported Dr. Halixistan, the Academy's chief psychologist. "She appears to be developing multiple parallel thought processes, each optimized for different combat disciplines." What the good doctor did not realize was that Maya was not developing multiple thought processes. She was developing what her grandmother might have recognized as Mushin, the martial artist's state of no mind, where conscious thought gave way to pure adaptive response. But instead of applying this concept to a single martial art, Maya was applying it to the entire spectrum of galactic combat disciplines. As her second semester progressed, Maya's reputation continued to grow. She was no longer seen as the weak human who somehow managed to keep up. She was becoming recognized as something unique, a fighter who could adapt to any opponent, counter any technique, and synthesize any combat discipline into her own expanding repertoire. But Maya knew she was still only scratching the surface of what was possible. Every technique she learned opened up new possibilities for combination and adaptation. Every opponent she faced taught her new ways to think about combat. The galaxy was full of fighting traditions she had not yet encountered, each representing new opportunities for growth and synthesis. As she prepared for her final semester, Maya smiled to herself. She had proven that human adaptability could compete with alien specialization. Now it was time to show the galaxy what happened when human adaptability reached its full potential. The universe was about to meet its first true master of universal combat, and she wore the face of a small, seemingly fragile human girl who had refused to accept limitations. The Weakling Girl, Final Chronicle. Maya's final semester brought the ultimate test. The Galactic Combat Academy's culminating challenge was the Synthesis Trials, a series of combat scenarios designed to test students against every major fighting discipline simultaneously. No student had ever mastered more than 3 or 4 disciplines well enough to advance to the elite ranks. Most specialized in one or two areas and accepted their limitations. The trials would pit Maya against the Academy's best students from each species, followed by the instructors themselves, and finally against the legendary combat masters who served as the Academy's ultimate arbiters of skill. It was a gauntlet designed to humble even the most gifted students and teach them the value of specialization. The synthesis trials will demonstrate why specialization is essential, announced Grandmaster Zeth Kalar, the Academy's supreme combat instructor. His ancient form showed the scars of 1,000 battles across the galaxy. No single being can master all forms of combat. Attempting to do so leads only to mediocrity in all areas. Maya listened quietly, but her mind was already analyzing the challenge ahead. She had spent the last year not just learning fighting techniques, but understanding the fundamental principles that connected all combat across the galaxy. Every species' approach to warfare reflected their evolution, psychology, and physical capabilities. But beneath these surface differences lay universal constants: geometry, physics, biomechanics, and psychology. The first phase of the trials tested pure technique in each discipline. Maya faced the top Karathi blade student, Zarthek, who had dismissed her abilities in her first semester. His movements were poetry in motion, each strike flowing seamlessly into the next with lethal precision. But Maya no longer fought like a human trying to copy Karathi techniques. She fought like someone who understood the principles underlying Karathi blade work and had adapted them to her own capabilities. Where Zarthek used his natural joint flexibility, Maya employed angular momentum. Where he relied on instinctive reactions, she used calculated positioning that put her in the right place before her opponent could react. The match lasted 17 minutes, longer than any blade combat in Academy history. When Maya finally scored the decisive point, Zarthek stared at her in amazement. "That was not Karathi fighting," he said quietly, "but it was more than Karathi fighting." Against the Vextar grappling champion, Groktar, Maya had evolved far beyond simple redirection techniques. She had learned to read the micro-expressions that preceded Vextar attacks, to sense the shift in weight distribution that telegraphed their intentions, to use their own breathing patterns against them. Groktar found himself thrown by attacks that seemed to come from nowhere, countered by techniques that violated everything he understood about grappling dynamics. "You fight like you know what I will do before I know it myself," Groktar admitted after their match. The Zephyrian energy combat proved even more shocking to the observers. Maya had developed her ability to sense energy patterns far beyond what anyone thought possible for a human. She could not generate the devastating energy attacks of her opponents, but she could redirect them, absorb them, and turn them back with interest. Her human density, initially seen as a limitation for energy work, had become an advantage that allowed her to ground and channel energies that would have overwhelmed beings more naturally attuned to energy manipulation. Against Morthek in shadow combat, Maya demonstrated that she had transcended her species' sensory limitations. She moved through the shadow dimensions not by seeing them directly, but by understanding their relationship to normal space so completely that she could navigate by pure geometric intuition. Her attacks came from angles that should have been impossible for someone bound to linear reality. The Christek trials revealed the true extent of Maya's adaptability. While her opponent reshaped his body into various weapon configurations, Maya reshaped her entire approach to match each transformation. Against a blade form, she became fluid. Against a hammer form, she became elusive. Against a net form, she became ungraspable. Her human inability to physically transform had been replaced by tactical transformation so complete that she became whatever her opponent could not effectively counter. The ethereal combat trial silenced the Academy completely. Maya fought Master Epoch Mind himself across multiple temporal layers, not by manipulating time, but by creating such tactical chaos that temporal prediction became impossible. Her human consciousness, operating on quantum uncertainty principles, generated too many possible futures for even ethereal foresight to parse. She won not by seeing the future, but by making the future unseeable. By the end of the individual trials, Maya had achieved something unprecedented. She had not just passed every discipline, she had excelled in each one while using techniques that no instructor had ever seen before. "This is impossible," muttered Dr. Helixistan, reviewing the combat analysis data. "She's using hybrid techniques that combine multiple disciplines simultaneously. Her brain activity shows she's processing 12 different combat frameworks in parallel." The second phase of the trials brought the real test. Maya would face multiple opponents simultaneously, each using different fighting disciplines. This was where the limitations of generalization were supposed to become apparent. No mind could adapt to multiple combat styles operating simultaneously. Maya entered the arena facing 6 opponents, one from each major discipline she had studied. They attacked in coordination, their different approaches designed to create conflicting demands that would overwhelm any single defensive strategy. But Maya no longer thought in terms of separate fighting styles. Her year of synthesis had created something new, a unified combat philosophy that treated all fighting as expressions of the same underlying principles. She did not switch between techniques to counter different opponents. She used a single, fluid approach that adapted to all opponents simultaneously. She moved like water, flowing around Korathi blade strikes while redirecting Vextar grapples. She absorbed Zephyrian energy attacks while dancing through Nexari shadow assaults. She predicted Christek transformations while creating temporal chaos that confused ethereal precognition, all simultaneously, all seamlessly, all as natural as breathing. The 6 opponents found themselves fighting not just Maya, but each other. Her movements turned their coordinated attacks into chaos. Korathi blade strikes meant for her hit Christek opponents. Vextar grapples tangled with Zephyrian energy streams. Nexari shadow attacks emerged into spaces occupied by ethereal temporal echoes. Within 10 minutes, all 6 opponents had yielded. They had been defeated not by superior force, but by their inability to maintain coordination against an opponent who turned their own techniques into weapons against each other. "Extraordinary," breathed Grandmaster Zethkalar. "She fights like she has been studying galactic combat for centuries." The final phase brought the ultimate challenge. Maya would face the combat masters themselves, beings with thousands of years of experience who had perfected their species' fighting techniques beyond anything students could achieve. Master Thexanal's blade work was so advanced, it seemed to bend reality. His strikes came from dimensions Maya did not know existed, but she countered them anyway, reading the geometric principles behind techniques she had never seen, adapting to innovations that predated human civilization. Master Velnath's shadow techniques operated on levels of reality that Maya could not perceive. But perception was no longer necessary. She fought by understanding, by knowing that all combat operated on universal principles, regardless of the dimensional layers involved. Master Quartzeth's transformations came so rapidly, they appeared simultaneous. But Maya's responses came even faster, not because she was quicker, but because she was no longer reacting to what she saw. She was responding to the logical necessities of combat geometry. One by one, the masters fell. Not defeated in the traditional sense, Maya was not stronger, faster, or more skilled than any of them in their individual specialties. But she had become something none of them could counter effectively. She fought with the accumulated knowledge of every combat discipline in the galaxy, synthesized into something greater than the sum of its parts. The final opponent was Grandmaster Zethkalar himself, a being so ancient and skilled that he was considered the pinnacle of galactic combat achievement. He had mastered multiple disciplines over his long life, making him the only opponent who might match Maya's synthetic approach. Their battle lasted 2 hours. It was not a contest of strength or speed, but of pure understanding. Each fighter demonstrated techniques that pushed their chosen disciplines to absolute limits. Maya fought with forms that had never been seen before, combinations that should have been impossible, adaptations that transcended the boundaries between species and fighting styles. When it ended, both fighters stood breathing heavily, neither clearly victorious. "Enough," declared Grandmaster Zeth Kalar. "I have seen what I needed to see." He turned to address the assembled academy, his ancient voice carrying clearly through the arena. For 10,000 years, this academy has taught the importance of specialization. We have believed that mastery comes through focus, that excellence requires limitation. Today, a small human has shown us something different. She has shown us that true mastery comes not from perfecting a single approach, but from understanding the principles that unite all approaches. The Grandmaster paused, studying Maya with something approaching awe. "Maya Chen, you have achieved something that was thought impossible. You have mastered not just multiple forms of combat, but the essence of combat itself. You fight not as a human or as any single species, but as a living embodiment of all galactic martial knowledge." The Academy erupted in stunned applause. Maya had not just passed the synthesis trials, she had redefined what combat mastery meant. In the weeks that followed, combat instructors from across the galaxy came to study Maya's techniques. Her synthesis approach began to influence martial training throughout the Coalition worlds. Young fighters from every species began attempting to combine techniques from multiple disciplines, though none approached Maya's intuitive understanding of universal combat principles. Maya herself remained modest about her achievements. She knew that her success came not from any special human ability, but from refusing to accept the limitations others had placed on her. She had approached each challenge not as an obstacle to overcome, but as an opportunity to understand something new about the nature of combat. As she prepared to leave the academy, now ranked as its first universal combat master, Maya reflected on her journey. She had proven that the greatest weakness could become the greatest strength if approached with the right mindset. Her human limitations had forced her to develop adaptability that transcended any single species' natural advantages. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about the nature of human potential. They were not the physically strongest or fastest or most naturally gifted species. But they possessed something even more valuable: the ability to learn from everyone, to adapt to everything, and to synthesize all knowledge into something greater than its parts. Maya Chen had shown the galaxy that sometimes the greatest masters are those who refuse to be mastered by their limitations. She had taken humanity's greatest weakness, their lack of natural combat specialization, and transformed it into the ultimate combat advantage. The small, seemingly fragile girl who had entered the academy as an object of pity left as a legend. She carried with her the knowledge of every fighting tradition in known space, synthesized into something entirely new. The universe had gained its first true universal warrior, and she was thoroughly, unmistakably human. Her story would be told for generations across the galaxy, the tale of the Weakling girl who mastered every form of combat by mastering the art of being human in a universe of specialists.